So good morning, dear family. How's everybody doing? Good. Happy Father's Day. It's wonderful to be sitting here together with everyone. Can everyone hear me? Is it a... Okay, so we're going to need the volume to go up a little. Okay. So this is a day of many firsts for Buddhism. One of the firsts is that we've begun the talk about 5 minutes earlier than scheduled. Usually it's about 15 minutes after the starting time that we begin. So this is a very special day, very auspicious. The other very special thing is this is the very first time that I'm doing a PowerPoint. So please don't be expecting any great animations or or videos or anything. And I've got a backup plan right here. For those of you who've been coming to Deer Park for many years, you know it's kind of not my style. I was trained as a chef, so it's a little bit like I do my preparation, and my preparation is walking, breathing, touching the earth. And then I come to the hall and have a little sense of, we need a little shake of this spice today, or a little stir of the pot this way. It's kind of an ongoing process. But when we do a PowerPoint, it's a little bit like going from being a soloist to playing in a band. We kind of have a structure that we need to follow. So it might be a little bit like buying a ticket to a U2 concert and then U2 plays 19th century German polka music for their concert. But that can be fun. Let's see how we go. Can anyone guess what we're going to be talking about today? Okay, so we're going to be talking about the 8 realizations. Occasionally in my life of practice, I have inspiration for a series of teachings that might take some time to ripen. It's been true a number of times, most notably for the winter retreat course that I offered, I think it was in 2011, 2012, that became the book Nothing to It. And it's the same with a series of teachings that I'm going to be offering on the 8 realizations. I had the inspiration, the strong inspiration about 3 years ago to offer these teachings, but it wasn't the right time. It hadn't ripened enough yet. But I feel very strongly that given where we are as individuals, as a community, as a nation, and in our world, this is the time to really offer these teachings. In the Plum Village tradition, we have a chanting book. Many of you have seen our hardcover chanting book, Plum Village Chanting a Recitation book, as it's imaginatively titled. And so it's quite a thick book these days, filled with discourses and ceremonies and other texts. Back when I ordained, this is what we had. This a pink spiral-bound book, which again is very imaginatively titled Plum Village Chanting Book. So we've added and recitation over the last 2 decades. In this book, there are just a few texts. There are 12 texts and a couple of ceremonies. So when we look at the texts that are in here, there are some very foundational texts, such as the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, the Discourse on Knowing the Better Way to Live Alone. These very core texts. So we would read the same ones over and over again, because that's all we had. So for me, there was one text in here that whenever I would have a chance to hear it, I'd be sitting in the hall and I'd hear the first line, wholeheartedly day and night. And I would immediately go into a stupa, like that. And then when I'd hear the end, dwelling forever in peace, I'd wake up again. I was so happy that it was over. I really hated the discourse on the 8 realizations of great beings. I'm not kidding, this was me, this is literally me, whenever that sutra would be read. And I'm the kind of person, I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person that becomes curious when I see I have a strong reaction or a strong resistance to something. And so I started to look into the origins of this text, the 8 realizations of great beings. And the first thing I realized was that it was incredibly important to our teacher, to Thay. In fact, when he was rescuing boat people when he was on the Roland and rescuing boat people in the South China Sea during the Vietnamese refugee crisis. This is the text that he translated and he offered to the boat people along with a commentary. That commentary, the English version of the commentary, is being published and is available both in a small pamphlet form called The Eight Realizations of Great Beings and a book form called The Two Treasures. It's together with another sutra. So I was intrigued because, as I mentioned before, whenever I would hear it, it sounded like the most boring text ever. It was like a shopping list to me. I was just thinking, like, why is this even in the chanting book? Like, there are so many other amazingly profound teachings, such as the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, even some of the Pali texts, such as Knowing the Better Way to Live Alone. Like, wow! But then we have this text that reads just like boom, 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 dwell forever in peace. So I was thinking, like, why does Thay find it so important? And I began my research and my study into this text and its origins, and it led me on an amazing, multifaceted journey of discovery. I'm just going to share a few aspects with you today. There's so much that we can share, and each of the things that we'll touch today is probably enough for a 3-month retreat. So we're just going to touch some things. Again, I've been looking into this text for a number of years and really delving quite deeply into its origins for about 3 years. So when we look at this text, which I'm going to be sharing about in the context of a series of 5 talks, including this one. So whenever I'm asked to give a talk on a Sunday, I'm going to come back to this topic. So we'll be touching each of the realizations and the origins of this text in some detail. This text is truly a treasure of insight, and it's presented in incredibly condensed form, which I think was part of the reason that I thought, like, I missed the point of it for so many years, for a couple of decades, that it's incredibly condensed. When I begin to discover some of these aspects of this text and how important it is, not it was, but it is, and how essential this teaching is for each one of us, I felt very similar to the Monkey King in the 16th century story Journey to the West by Wu Cheng-en. There's a scene in that wonderful story. This is actually from my very favorite TV show. It's called Monkey. It showed in Australia from 1980. It's still showing now. People love it. It's a cult hit. It was so deep. This is really my first contact with Buddhism. We used to, as children in the playground at school, we would all fight over who could be the Monkey King, who would be Tripitaka, the monk, and who would get to be the Buddha, and we would get a coin, lick it, and put it on our forehead, and be the Buddha. It's an amazing series. It's an amazing text from the 16th century, and in that text, there's a scene in which the Monkey King is in the cave of the slanting moon and 3 stars, and this is his opportunity to first hear the Dharma. And as he's hearing the Dharma talk, he's sitting in the back of the hall. He gets increasingly excited, and his tail starts tapping the ground, he's looking around, his eyes are darting, and his hands start waving in the air. Just so excited to hear the Dhamma. Now this was really my experience with this text, that on the surface seemed like absolutely nothing. The 8 Realizations is a complete overview of the Mahayana Buddhist path, from the very basic to the most profound insights of Mahayana Buddhism. As I mentioned above, the very first question that I asked myself was, why was this text important to Thay? Why did he choose it to offer to the boat people? Why is it in our chanting book? Where did it come from? Who translated it into Chinese? It didn't just magically appear in Chinese. These questions led me to my first series of discoveries. The Sutra of the 8 Realizations of Great Beings was translated into Chinese by a Parthian monk whose name was An Shigao. In Vietnamese, this is An Te Cao, around the year 140 of the Common Era. Now let's stop for a moment. Some of you are thinking like, well, that's not a really amazing realization. An Shigao, Parthian monk, blah, blah, blah. Let's get to the good stuff. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. He was from the capital of the kingdom of Parthia. Is that exciting for anyone? Is anyone excited about that? I am. So, does anyone know where Parthia was? The kingdom of Parthia. This is partially why these teachings are really essential. Parthia, the kingdom of Parthia, was in the vicinity of modern-day Iran, Iraq. Master An Shigao was born in a town called Ctesiphon, which nowadays is about 20 miles, about the distance from here to San Diego from Baghdad. An Shigao these days would most likely have Iraqi nationality. We tend to think of Buddhism nowadays as an East Asian phenomenon. Buddhism arose in India, somehow got to China, and then was transmitted down to Vietnam and Korea, Japan, etc., or went south to the southern countries such as Sri Lanka, Thailand, and so on. Very few of us spend time to consider deeply how did it travel? We hear, and who are these people that transmitted Buddhism? We hear occasionally of things such as statues in Afghanistan, in places such as Bamiyan, which were unfortunately destroyed a few years ago, although they're being restored at the moment. But this information slips from our mind like yesterday's lotto numbers. It's just a blip. It doesn't register with us. We think of Buddhism in India, and then suddenly it's in Vietnam, suddenly it's in China. There's a whole missed history here. And it's time for us to reclaim our roots. As we reclaim the roots of Buddhism, we also recenter ourselves from the Eurocentric model of history to a model of history that's much more holistic and centers around an area of the world that nowadays is put into a certain category or stereotyped in some way, the Middle East, which we refer to as what? The cradle of civilization. When we think of the cradle of Western civilization, we think of Mesopotamia, which is Iran, Iraq, this area. So in studying the origins of this text and why it was important to Thay, we start to discover the importance of what is called the Silk Road Buddhism, or Silk Road transmission of Buddhism. Back in the day in Plum Village, in the beginning of 1997, Winter Retreat 1996, 1997, Thay had a series of, I was going to say DVDs, but they're actually VHS cassettes. We don't see those much anymore. They were called it was a documentary called The Silk Road. It was about 12 hours of documentary that Thay insisted that we all watch. So we would all sit, and we had that series of documentaries. We also, the movies we had were that, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and Gandhi. They were the three things that we had in Plum Village that we could watch. So we spent a lot of time on the Silk Road. And it was, nowadays I look back and I realize very soon after that, Thay was writing books such as Master Tang Hoi and others which we'll touch in a moment. Thay wanted us to understand this period of Buddhism, this period of history, to understand that Buddhism is not some East Asian phenomenon, and it's not foreign from our roots, but it's been there cross-pollinating all along. So Buddhism was known and influential, and it cross-pollinated with local traditions all along what we call the Silk Road. This is Buddhism not as a philosophy, but as a lived spiritual tradition. There were monasteries and temples and monastics all along the Silk Road. In fact, when we research the Silk Road period, we can find that around the time of the beginning of the Common Era in the 1st century, there were 40 monasteries and temples around Kabul, for example, in Afghanistan. We don't think of these things. Even in one of the texts in the Pali Canon, which is known as the Questions of King Milinda, which are questions that a king asked a Buddhist monk. Many of us, we don't even realize that King Milinda is the pronunciation of King Menanda, the Emperor Menanda, who was a Greek emperor, who was asking questions about Buddhism. And it became part of the Pali Canon. You can go and read this amazing text. So, for me, I feel this period of Buddhism is essential to understand. And this is one of the first things that awakened for me as I began researching the origins of the 8 realizations of great beings. I always carry a piece of lapis lazuli with me. I have it here. I have a couple of pieces. This is a larger one. I brought it so you can see it. There's a couple of reasons I carry this with me. It's a healing stone. It's also a stone that's very rooting, which I think these teachings are. And it's also a stone that comes from Afghanistan. So it reminds me of the origins of many of the important teachings and texts that we have today. Does somebody have their phone on? Would you be so kind to put it in silent mode? Thank you. I feel because of the current political and social situation, it's really important to think of this area and think of those people that help to transmit Buddhism to us. Many of the people in the Middle East nowadays are descendants of some of the great teachers that we'll speak of in a few moments. So as a very brief overview, and believe me, this is brief, very brief. Buddhism entered China via the Silk Road in the 1st and 2nd centuries. So this is a map of what we commonly call the Silk Road. So you'll notice here that this is what we normally think of as the Silk Road. This is China over here. This is what we roughly just lump together as the Middle East, but actually was very distinct regions. And then this, of course, is Europe, Arabia, India, and East Asia over here. So you notice that there's a land route, but there's also a maritime route as well. So when we think of Buddhism going north to China, it was more like northeast. And then we think of the south, it's traveling in the maritime route. And I've given teachings on some aspects of this before, such as the Bahia Sutra, in which Bahia was a trader from this area who got washed up on the shore of India and became a monk. So there was a maritime and a land route. So at its peak, the Silk Road extended all the way from the Pacific to what? To the Mediterranean. It was incredibly important, not only for trade, but for the crossing of cultures, the crossing of traditions, the crossing of spiritual traditions. There's a couple of things I'll point out here in this very brief overview because they'll be of importance later. Please notice Sogdia here. Sogdia was a very important area of trade and an important area of Buddhism. Sogdia, the Sogdian kingdom, overlapped parts of Iran and in this area here. This is also where Master Tang Hoi's father was born. Master Tang Hoi was the first Zen patriarch in Vietnam. He was born here in Sogdia. Over here, we see Ctesiphon, which is about 20 miles from Baghdad. So this is where we'll come to later on. This is where Master An Shigao, Ante Kao, was born here. So Buddhism was brought to China by monks who nowadays would probably be considered as Westerners, all from this area. This is a mural that I love a lot. There are so many pictures and murals like this. It's from the 16th century. I'm sorry, 9th century. I have the 16th in my head because I'm still thinking about the Monkey King. from the 9th century, and it's found in the Bezeklik Thousand Buddha Caves in Western China. So you see here is a Sogdian monk. Oh, we've gone forward. We see here a Sogdian monk. Sogdia, again, is where Master Tang Hoi's father was born. And this Sogdian monk, the story goes, was one of the monks that brought Buddhism to China and was teaching and ordaining Chinese monastics. A blue-eyed monk from Sogdia. So in that period of time, it was Middle Easterners, what we would call nowadays, and that's a conventional designation, Middle Easterners from the cradle of what we call Western civilization, who brought Buddhism to China. Most people nowadays, especially if we're coming out of Chinese traditions or the East Asian traditions, we overlook the Silk Road period, the period that lasted, five centuries or so. And we go right away to Master Sunzang, who was active in the late 5th and 6th centuries, Master Huinzhang, who traveled to India to bring more texts back to China. And we overlook this important period, which is a bit of a pity. We don't really have time to delve into that today. I just wanted to present it in brief because I feel it's important as we delve into the origins of this text. However, if you would like to explore this a little further, then here are some resources. Buddhism and Islam on the Silk Road. Buddhism and Islam coexisted and cross-pollinated for a period of time. This is a fascinating work. And then Buddhism in Central Asia, which is a little academic, to be honest, but it's still quite interesting. The Greek Buddha, which talks about the impact and interrelationship between the Greek civilization and Buddhism, and how Buddhism influenced Greek culture and vice versa. In fact, for those of you who've studied sculpture, you know that many of the first images of the Buddha came about, the statues came about when Buddhism came into contact with Greek culture. Think about the way the robes are and things, and think about the Gandharan period of Buddhism. I'm a history nerd and I'm a sutra nerd. I get excited about this. I hope this is interesting for you as well. The other book that I highly recommend is The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, which recenters us from our Eurocentric model to a model of the importance of the Middle East, both in the transmission of culture and in the transmission of spirituality. The first documented translation efforts of Buddhist texts by Buddhist monks in China was around the beginning of the 2nd century AD, and An Shigao, Ante Gao, was the very first translator. There were 37 well-known figures, 37 translators who were born along the Silk Road and were active in either the transmission of Buddhism to China or translation of key texts. We're not going to talk about the 37 of them today. We're just going to touch a couple of them to help everybody to see the extent of the work that was done. So Ansun, who was from Parthia, again, the same area, Iraq, Iran, that An Shigao was from. And he worked together with An Shigao, actually. He was known for translating some of the earliest Mahayana texts into Chinese. We have Kumarajiva. Kumarajiva was from the kingdom of Kuchia, which was on the northern edge of the Taklamakan desert on the Silk Road. He was active in the 4th century. Among his many translations, and there are many, was the Diamond Sutra, which would not have come to us until much later. The Amitabha Sutra, one of the most important sutras in Chinese Buddhism. The Vimalakirti Nidesa Sutra, which is one of the key sutras that took the emphasis away from monastic Buddhism, like the idea that monastics or monasticism was the only way that people could practice, and re-emphasized the importance of practice in daily life, that those of us who are householders can often be superior to monastics in our practice and insight. It was a real, I guess you would call it nowadays, the drop of a mic. It's a really strong text on bringing down the pride that was evident in some of our monastic communities or monastics at the time, and recognizing that this is a fourfold effort. It's a really important text. And then the treatise on the middle way, which we in Plum Village have studied quite extensively through Thay. It's by Nagarjuna. There's also someone who's very well known to the monastics in the room and those of us of Vietnamese origin. That's Kang Sang Hue, Kum Tang Hoi, Master Tang Hoi. He passed away in 280 of the Common Era. His father was from Sogdia, again, an area of Iran. He's honored as bringing Buddhism to Vietnam. And we have actually statues of Master Tang Hoi in our meditation hall. Thay's written a book on Master Tang Hoi, which is available. I think we have many copies. He's especially known for a translation of the Anapanasati Sutra, which is the Sutra on mindful awareness of breathing, into Chinese. It's thanks to these foreigners, what we would call foreigners, who were in fact from what we call the cradle of civilization, the cradle of Western civilization, the Buddhist texts and traditions were transmitted to China, and through China to East Asia, to Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and so on. So I'd like us, to think about that for a moment. This is a Western monastic gathering. You might recognize a few faces here. Brother Phap Dung, the second abbot of Deer Park. You might recognize this person. I don't know who it is. And then you see Sister Thuận Tiên, and you see a number of monastics of many different traditions and origins back in 2004. There's a mistaken perception that Buddhism is a foreign tradition to those of us raised in what we call the West. West of what? I think that's a question we have to start asking. Or that we Westerners don't have deep cultural roots in Buddhism. As we learn more about the Silk Road period and the spread and influence of Buddhism, we find that this is absolutely incorrect. It's not correct. From the very beginnings, Buddhism has been part of our cultural heritage. And in fact, our ancestors found it of such importance that they didn't have planes or anything back in the day. They were traveling for months and months and months and years to translate and transmit these teachings. The Silk Road period was an immense time of cross-pollination. Many interesting works have been written about the interrelationship between Buddhism and the other desert traditions, such as Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And it's thanks to all of the work of all of those ancestors that Buddhism came to us in its form today. So for me, I feel like I want to pause here for a moment just to consider that. This is important for us to reroot. Buddhism is not something foreign to our roots. We edge ever closer to the 8 realizations. And we get closer by taking a few moments to consider a little bit about An Shigao, An Tekao, who was the translator of this important sutra. Thay used to speak a lot about An Shigao over and over again. An Shigao was born around about 148 of the Common Era in Ctesiphon, which is the capital of the Kingdom of Parthia, which was currently located in Iraq. He was a prince who renounced his throne and became a monk. Sounds a lot like the Buddha's story. This was An Shigao. His father was a marquis. The first documented translations into Chinese were the work of Master An Shigao. There are currently 11 texts that are existent that we can actually look at and say, this is the work of An Shigao. There are others that may or may not be his work, but 11 fascicles that we can actually put our fingers on. He worked to establish Buddhist centers of learning and practice in the vicinity of modern-day Luoyang, which is in China. And he was the first of what became a wave of these Silk Road Buddhist teachers, these teachers from what we call nowadays the Middle East, who brought Buddhism to China. The wave of teachers from what we call the West to China lasted about 4 centuries. So he was the first of that wave. Among his many translations was the 8 Realizations of Great Beings. This text is traditionally regarded as the second sutra to be translated into Chinese. The first sutra was, of course, the Sutra of 42 Chapters, which the Most Venerable here in Deer Park has given teachings on. And for me, this underlines the importance of this text. Why would An Shigao bother to translate a shopping list and when he was trying to transmit Buddhism to China? So this really underlines its importance. Oh, there we go. There was a shampoo ad back in the 1980s in Australia that said it won't happen overnight, but it will happen. And so occasionally the points will appear. There are 3 versions of the root text of the 8 realizations that we're going to be working with during this series of teachings. I thought about it quite a lot, but I decided not to use the Chinese text because many of us here are not fluent in Chinese. So I decided to use 3 different translations into English from the Chinese. The first is Thay's translation. This is the translation that was offered to the boat people and is part of our Plum Village chanting book. I have also decided to use Master Xing Yun, Venerable Master Xing Yun's translation from his book Buddhism Pure and Simple. Master Xing Yun is a very great master who is currently resident in Taiwan, and he is my 5 mindfulness training teacher. And then a translation from the Zhongtai Buddhist Institute. As we work through the text and consider how to apply these essential teachings in our daily life, we'll find that there are sometimes different emphases in each of the translations that I felt were important for us to bring out. So the 8 Realizations of Great Beings Sutra is not an analytical text. This is really important to understand. This is not a text that analyzes many different states of consciousness or is incredibly abstruse or theoretical, such as some of the later works that have been brought down to us. But it's a practical and effective meditation manual. Again and again, our teacher Thay has asked us, whenever we read a teaching, to ask an important question. How do I apply this teaching to my daily life? So the 8 Realizations of Great Beings Sutra is exactly that. It's a practical and effective manual of meditation. We're meant to use this, not just to look at it, put it away, but we're meant to use it each and every moment of our lives. There's a strong emphasis in this sutra on the everyday life, on life right here and right now. This is what you do, which is part of the reason that it was praised and has been and still continues to be praised by great teachers throughout history. For some reason, it's not taught often in our modern society, but it's been praised throughout history. I think it's because we tend to like ideas. We have our sutra opening verse. We now have a chance to see the Dhamma, to hear it, to study it, and what? To practice it. I feel like the last part, putting it into practice, is sometimes a bit of a challenge. So this is one of the reasons that this text has been praised by masters throughout history. Why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell? Do you know, when I began to prepare this talk today, I thought I'll need just 3 slides. Just 3 slides will be fine. And then we've got 24 slides. So it's kind of moved on a little bit like that. So we're about halfway through. We discover how to apply this sutra in the very first line of the sutra. So the introduction to the sutra reads, "Wholeheartedly, day and night, a disciple of the Buddha should recite and meditate upon the 8 realizations discovered by the great beings." This is Thay's translation. Master Xing Yun's translation is, "For all disciples of the Buddha, morning and night, hold them in your mind and chant them often, these 8 realizations of great beings." And the Zhongtai Buddhist Institute, day and night at all times. So that we can see the comment here, at all times. Buddha's disciples should mindfully recite and contemplate these 8 realizations of great beings. This is the introduction, the very first line of the sutra. Now, tradition tells us that the sutra was prompted by a question that Aniruddha, one of the Buddha's greatest disciples, asked him. In fact, in our chanting book, there's another sutra called the Aniruddha Discourse. You might have noticed that there are a couple of interesting parts about the introduction. Most Buddhist sutras begin with a phrase, "Thus have I heard." This one does not. It's one of the very few texts in the Buddhist canon that doesn't begin with that phrase. So tradition tells us that Aniruddha came to the Jeta Grove while the Buddha was in the Jeta Grove and asked the Buddha the following question. He said, "We who are monastics, we know we need to live by the 6 harmonies and treat everyone, including ourselves, with loving kindness and compassion. So how are householders meant to act? How should they behave if they want to be liberated?" And the Buddha replied, "That's a good question. This question relates to the realizations of all great beings, of all those who came before and all those who will come after. I will now explain to you that which day and night you should hold in your mind." So this is the backstory, and then it goes into wholeheartedly day and night. So how should we apply this text when we look at that introduction? With all our being, wholeheartedly, at all times, day and night. Not only on the meditation cushion, but right in the heart of our daily life, in traffic, in the line to serve lunch, when we are at work, not just at certain moments when we are quote-unquote practicing, but right in the very heart of our daily life, however messy it is. That is when we need to be reciting and holding. I love the fact that there's that phrase, reciting and contemplating, in this first introductory line. It means many things, but it basically, for the context of our reflection on this sutra, it means holding in our consciousness, contemplating through our day, and putting it into action. So from our mind consciousness, we put into action the realizations that we discover in these sutras. Oh, there we go. I am kind of just flowing. The other interesting part that I found in this text is that most of the time when we read a Buddhist text, we discover, after "thus have I heard," we discover that it's mentioned where the Buddha was and who he was speaking to. Thus have I heard, at one time the Buddha was in the Jeta Grove and he was surrounded by 1,250 monastics and da 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 da. So we hear immediately who the audience is. Here we don't have this phrase at all. We don't have "thus have I heard," and we don't have an audience there. However, it says something very essential in this introduction, which again underlies the importance and the essential nature of these teachings. To all disciples of the Buddha, to everybody, to you right now. It doesn't say the Buddha gave these teachings at one time. It's saying to each and every disciple of the Buddha in all times. This is one way that the importance of these teachings are emphasized. The core text of the 8 realizations is divided into 2 sections. The first section is the first realization, which we'll explore together today. And it presents the Buddha's core insights into the nature of reality. The Buddha is basically telling us, this is how it is. This is how I see the world. This is my insight. And then the remaining 7 realizations in this text present how we should live in the world as a disciple of the Buddha, as a disciple that is practicing to wake up in whichever way we ourselves need to wake up. How we need to live in the world in order to manifest this insight. So it's important to, even though I said it's not an analytical text, I realize that I'm analyzing the text here. So it's a paradox, and I'm okay with that. Because as we explore this text, I feel like that's an important understanding to have. From this insight, whether it's the Buddha's insight in the case of this text, or it's our own insight into our own situation, we need to be asking ourselves the next question. How do I walk this? How do I eat this? How do I wash the dishes with this? How do I bring this right into the heart of my life as it is? Otherwise, it's just words written on a paper, or it's a great idea. It's a philosophy. It's not a lived reality. So how do I root this insight? And how do I manifest it in my own unique way? How do I bring this into the heart of my life? I feel like that could warrant a bell and a few breaths. So bearing in mind that the first realization is the Buddha's insight into reality and presents the Buddha's view of existence, let's have a look at the first realization and the 3 different translations that we're using. They're quite similar for the first realization. However, as we move on into others in future talks, we'll see that, as I mentioned earlier, the emphasis is a little different. So the first realization is the awareness that the world is impermanent. Political regimes are subject to fall. We'll just take a breath there. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen. Things composed of the four elements are empty, containing within them the seeds of suffering. Human beings are composed of five aggregates and are without a separate self. They are always in the process of change, constantly being born and constantly dying. They are empty of self and without a separate existence. The mind is the source of all confusion, and the body the forest of all unwholesome action. Meditating on this, you can be released from the round of birth and death. So that's Thay's translation of the first realization. Venerable Master Xing Yun realized that the world is impermanent, that nations are unsafe and unstable, that the four elements cause suffering and are empty, and that there is no self within the five skandhas, that all things that arise must change and decline, and that they are but false appearances without any stable essence, that the mind is the source of evil, and that form is a congregation of wrongdoings. Contemplate all this, and gradually you will disentangle yourself from the cycle of birth and death. The Zhongtai Buddhist Institute, all the world is impermanent. The earth is fragile and perilous. The four great elements inhere in suffering and emptiness. Or you could change the sentence a little bit and say, suffering and emptiness are inherent in the four great elements, if it's clearer for you. In the five skandhas, there is no self. All that arise, change, and perish are elusive, unreal, and without a master. Mind is the root of evil, body a reservoir of sin. Thus, observing and contemplating, one gradually breaks free from birth and death. So, please note that the last sentence in the first realization, which is translated very similarly in all three translations, is the fruit of the understanding. The fruit that will occur by embodying the four key awarenesses, the four areas of contemplation or insight in the first realization. The fruit is liberation from what we call the endless round of samsara, the endless round of the same thing over and over and over again. That one of the insights of Buddhism is that there's an endless round inside us, in our own mind and around us, of the same thing over and over again. These patterns of suffering that keep going on until finally we discover that there's a way out. There's a way to transform that situation. The four contemplations here, the four areas of contemplations, are not philosophical concepts, but they're doorways of realization for us to walk through in each moment. It's said that if we want to gauge our own realization, our own mindfulness, or somebody else's, have a look, and as we go out of the meditation hall, have a look and see how we put our shoes, how tidy they are, whether we take care of the everyday things. Anyone can give a great philosophical discourse, but how do they wash their dishes? How do we interact? How do we put our shoes by the door? So let's consider these contemplations. The first one is impermanence. We heard about impermanence in different aspects as we listened to the first realization. Impermanence or anicca here means everything within us and around us is constantly in a state of change. There are those of us that when we touch this deeply, we experience almost an existential crisis. That this is, the ground just seems to go out from under our feet. And that's completely understandable, because we have a tendency to hold on to things that by their nature are constantly in a state of change. The Buddha didn't teach impermanence for us to suffer or to discourage us or to go around and, as a young staff member in Plum Village in 1998 in the summer retreat, said to wear black, dark sunglasses and sit in the back of a cafe and smoke cigars all day. But rather for us to live our life beautifully and meaningfully, to be able to touch the preciousness of this moment, which won't occur again. If we look around this hall, there's no chance that we'll all be in the same hall in exactly the same position at some point in the future. This moment will not occur again. What a precious moment this is. When I offer a retreat, I always, at the end of a retreat, I take time in the closing circle for everyone to look around and consider all the different places we came from today, or at the beginning of the retreat, and where we're about to go. And will we ever have a chance to meet each other again? And the truth is we're not going to. How precious is that? How precious it is. A few years ago, I was in Oregon, and I was offering a retreat up there with some other brothers and sisters, and there was an old woman there who was a calligrapher. She was making wind wishes, little wishes, and she would hang them on the trees, and these calligraphed phrases and words, and it was just a beautiful thing. She made me a big calligraphy, which I've hung in my office, opposite my desk. It says, "Each moment only once." Each moment only once. Unfortunately, a brother was recently rearranging the office and put a cabinet in front of it, but so it kind of says, "Each mo-ns." At the moment, each mo-ns. But I also feel it's kind of poetic too, like each moment only once. The calligraphy had an opportunity to kind of be the center of attention, and now things have moved on. It fits. I like it. So not taking this moment for granted is one of the fruits of realizing our own impermanence and the impermanence of the world around us. When I was practicing in Sri Lanka, I spent some time there practicing intensely in the mountains in a town called Bandarawela. There's a hermitage called Kolatenna Hermitage, which is in the tea plantations up in the mountains of Sri Lanka. So my room was like cement floors and everything, but it had an enclosed walking meditation path. It was about 10 or 15 paces long. So, we'd wake up and I had it was kind of like a podium. It didn't have a cushion or anything. That's where I would sit. And then there was a walking meditation path. And at the end of the walking meditation path was a skeleton, which wasn't to be Gothic or anything, but it was to remind whoever was practicing there of the nature of reality, that we are going to die. Not at some point in the future, but we're dying and being born right here and right now, physically, for sure. Within 7 years, all of the cells in our body renew themselves. But also mentally, each and every moment, thoughts are being born, they're existing for a period of time, they're passing away. Death is not something that occurs at some point in the future, but is happening each and every moment. So what do I want to give birth to in my life? What do I want to give birth to in my mind? What do I want to set my heart upon? It's important as we contemplate inner change and outer change, as we bring that into our awareness, that we ask ourselves, can something become nothing? Can something become nothing? Thay, our teacher, shared the beautiful story of walking under the autumn leaves a number of years ago in France. And there was a leaf that fell from the tree. There's a lot of oak trees around Plum Village, so I like to imagine it's an oak tree, but it could have been a number of other trees. A leaf falling from the tree and falling down onto the earth. And Thay was contemplating and asking, was the leaf sad? Was the leaf worried that it would become nothing? And then, can we look a little bit more deeply? And as the leaf lets go of that previous existence as a leaf on a tree and falls to the ground, then does it just disintegrate into nothing, or does it become something else? If we look deeply, it dries up, it becomes the soil. Eventually, over time, it nurtures the soil and perhaps sinks down into the roots. Again, nurtures the roots and might spring up as a leaf, again at some point in the future. That's the insight of interbeing, of impermanence, right there. Something cannot become nothing. We hear the beautiful song that Sister Chen Kong sings very often at the time of death. Death is but a hide and seek game, a constant, just an illusion. But things continue on in so many ways. So the first invitation into contemplation in this very first realization, to be able to root the insight of the Buddha into our lived existence, is to contemplate impermanence. For those of us who are getting older, it's easy to contemplate some aspects of impermanence. I heard somebody told me that gray hairs are called sparkle strands, which I like a lot, sparkle strands. For me, every time I shave my head, I see more and more sparkle strands. We also we notice the change of our bodies. We notice that it's more difficult to stand up. It's sometimes difficult to walk. We can't see as well as we used to see. And so things like that, but also the impermanent nature within. And as we contemplate that impermanence, it's not discouraging, but it's invitational. What can I do in this moment so that this moment, this breath, this step can become the most meaningful breath, meaningful step, meaningful interaction that I've had? This is the invitation of impermanence. The second area of contemplation in the first realization is emptiness, or shunyata. Emptiness or shunyata goes hand in hand with impermanence. Basically, emptiness means that there's no thing that can exist in and by itself alone. That everything is interdependent, and that everything interpenetrates. In the Plum Village tradition, rather than using the word emptiness, or the old translation up until about 1950, which the old translators used to call it the void. Everything is void. It sounds very negative to us. Even the word emptiness can sound quite negative, when in fact it's not a negative realization. It's not like the Buddha didn't wake up to emptiness and just get depressed. But in fact it was a doorway of awakening. It's called a doorway of liberation. We use the word interbeing, which encapsulates this insight of interpenetration, of interrelationship. As I breathe out, you breathe in. Truthfully, we're all breathing in each other's out-breaths right now. My breath within me is, oxygen has been flowing around all the cells in my body. The same with you. And so as you breathe out, you're offering that around. Isn't that wonderful? All that inspiration, all the energy and things that's going out into the air in this moment. We're touching that. There was a wonderful study that was done that actually shares how molecules, transmit themselves around the world, and that we're breathing in all these molecules that once belonged to famous people, James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, the Buddha, right in the air that we're breathing in. It's not an inanimate object. This air that has carried words of peace, words of compassion, words of insight. and words of violence, of separation, of anxiety, air that carries sound. We wouldn't have received the teachings of the Buddha without air. And all of that was offered out into air and is now part of what we breathe in. This is not a philosophy, this is scientific reality. Interbeing, recognizing the cloud in the tea, looking and seeing that each thing contains everything else. But even when we hear the word interbeing, or we hear the invitation to look into the cloud in our tea, to look at the sun in our carrot and things, it can still be a little bit theoretical. So importantly, the Buddha offers us a practice with emptiness, with interbeing in this first insight. A concrete method for us to contemplate. That's the interbeing nature of the four elements within us and around us. The Buddha says, okay, everything's empty, especially the four elements. The four great elements which all life consists of: air, water, fire, and earth. And here, again, we're reminded that things can't exist by themselves alone. Fire can't exist in the absence of oxygen, and so on. One of the most ancient Buddhist meditation practices, among the 40 ancient Buddhist meditation practices, is a meditation on the four elements. The four elements within us and the four elements around us. It's a beautiful exercise of seeing how we inter-are with what we call the world outside. This coming fall retreat, probably in late October, November or something, I'm thinking of offering on 4 consecutive Sundays a short introduction to meditation. So, and one of the exercises we'll do is the exercise on meditating on the four elements. We'll begin with basic meditation instruction on mindfulness of breathing and some of the guided meditation exercises in No Mud, No Lotus, which is our meditation book, and with a special emphasis on the four elements because it's an incredibly important realization. Then in this first realization, we're invited to contemplate the non-self within the 5 skandhas. One of the most, or anatta, one of the most central teachings of Buddhism that flows on from the insight of interbeing is that there's no permanent entity of what we call the Holy Trinity of I, me, and my. That if we contemplate impermanence outside and we contemplate the impermanence of our thought process and we begin to understand this on more and more subtle levels, we have a realization that there's nothing really permanent that we can call I, me, and my. We're changing each and every moment. In this first realization, we're being invited to contemplate the 5 skandhas. It's mentioned in all three versions of the translation, the 5 skandhas. This is how the 5 skandhas are how we normally identify ourselves. This is what we refer to when we say I, me, and my, the 5 skandhas. And some of us might have a tendency towards one or the other. We might identify ourselves with our form, our body. Oh no, I have a wrinkle, or I have more sparkle strands than I had before. It's all over. What am I going to do? Or we identify ourselves with our feelings. In one moment in time, we might think, oh, I'm just this anger, or I'm just this happiness, or I'm just this. We identify strongly here. Or we might identify with our motivations, our volition, or our perceptions, the things we see. I see this and that's how I define it, that's how it is, or consciousness, our mind. Together, this is what we refer to when we say I, this collection of 5 aspects of our being. The Buddha's invitation is for us to contemplate and see, is form something that's always the same? from moment to moment, or is it changing? Is it developing? How about perception? Things we perceive, is that changing? How about feelings? Do we have the same feeling from moment to moment, or is it is it changing? Do we always feel angry? I certainly hope not. Do we always feel happy? Well, maybe. That would be great. What about our motivations? Our volition? Is that changing? So we bring our awareness, our mindfulness, to contemplate these 5 skandhas. They are interrelated. You see, there's a great diagram here. I chose this image because I thought it was great. It shows how it interrelates. Thay likes to draw a diagram, which I couldn't find, of the 5 segments of an orange. Together it makes an orange. So they all inter-are. And then the final area of contemplation is what's called impurity. The purpose of Buddhism is to cultivate and generate understanding and compassion. And we need to be humble enough to admit to ourselves that we don't know. We don't know things completely. Even if we think we do, to ask ourselves, are we sure? One great master once said, don't waste your time trying to understand the Buddha. Turn around and understand your own mind. This is the basic emphasis of this text, the 8 realizations. By presenting the Buddha's insight, then we move on and say, okay, turn it around. This is how you need to manifest this. So don't waste our time with all kind of philosophical things, but turn our attention around and understand ourselves. Our meditative tradition comes out of the mind-only school and says that everything's considered to be in existence because of the interrelationship between what we call our mind and objects of mind, that they interrelate. Don't worry, we're not going to go too much into that. But basically, in our philosophical school, we talk about the fact that we're each living in our own reality, because each of us has different ways that we respond to stimuli, different ways that we relate to something. For some of us, will hear a sound like a cough. Thank you, it was perfect. A cough, and some of us will all have different responses. Some will think, oh man, it was so annoying. Some of us will think, oh, I hope she's okay. Some of us will have other reactions. So who's right and who's wrong? The interrelationship between our consciousness and what we call the world around, or objects of mind, that's what creates what we call reality. And mind here is not defined in a limited way, but in this extensive way. This 4th contemplation, the 4th area of awareness, is traditionally translated as impurity. We heard some strong phrases in the first realization, such as the mind is like a source of all confusion, and the body the forest of unwholesome action. So here's what we're talking about. When we hear the word impurity, what it basically means is not in and of itself. Not in and of itself. It basically means that the things we normally run after to give us that little moment of comfort or ease, by their very nature, can't do that. By their very nature, are changing all the time. It's a recognition of our tendency to continually run after something that we think is going to give us what we're looking for. Whether that be happiness, peace, liberation, a good cup of coffee. We're always searching after something on the coarse levels and on the more subtle levels. So here it's an invitation for us to bring our attention back and to ask ourselves, to recognize what we referred to before as our volition, what we're being pulled towards or being repelled away from. What's our thirst in this moment? Sometimes we translate the word tanha as craving, but I like the word thirst. I think it is much more descriptive. what we're seeking for. We cannot get fulfillment from the things outside and around because by their nature they're constantly changing. Perhaps by using a concrete practice such as looking at the 4 nutriments or others, we begin to recognize that we have already all the conditions we think we need, all the things that we're searching for outside. We begin to understand the landscape, the individual landscape of our searching. Each one of us is searching for different things. There's some commonality, but we have different emphases. So to understand the individual landscape of our searching. And then if we're really lucky, and we apply the teachings of mindfulness as our teacher has offered us, we begin to recognize that in this very moment, right now, we have all the conditions we're looking for. We have already, we can touch already that which we think is something in the future, but it's available for us now. And this is the invitation that we receive in our own lineage from our great teacher, the founder of our lineage, Master Rinzai, Master Lamte, who said, please, please stop all of your running. Turn your attention around and become the true person. Become a real human being. That's the invitation of Master Rinzai and the invitation of this 4th area of contemplation. So I'm so grateful, dear friends, that we got through this. I hope it was helpful. This first talk, we needed to share a little bit about some quite disparate topics, such as the Silk Road and everything, but I really wanted to underline the importance of this text. As we move forward into the Buddha's teachings in the other 7 realizations, and see how we apply this in our daily life, how we root this insight in our daily life, we'll go much more slowly than we did today. And I'm also going to weave in some personal stories from my own life as we go through the next 7 realizations. So I wish you a wonderful day of practice. I'm so delighted that you've chosen to spend your day here together with us. Thanks for being there, and may something today have been helpful. Have a wonderful rest of the day.